This is BBC World News. I'm Samantha Simmons. Our top stories. President Trump rejects suggestions he is mentally unfit for office, describing himself as a stable genius. Airstrikes on rebel strongholds near the Syrian capital Damascus. Aid workers say hospitals have been hit. Snow, gales, ice and floods. The extreme weather hitting much of the eastern US and Canada, and it's set to get even colder. Also in the programme, as UK companies reveal a gender pay gap, just why are men paid more than women? Hello and welcome to BBC World News. President Trump has rejected suggestions by the author of a controversial new book that he is mentally unfit for the White House. In a series of tweets, Mr. Trump called himself a very stable genius, and he said his two greatest assets in life had been his mental stability and being smart. It all follows the publication of a book by Michael Wolff that said many of the president's staff view him as childlike. Jessica Parker reports.
Boarding a flight to Camp David for high-level meetings. And here's the image Trump's team is trying to project. Order, professionalism, control. Getting on with the job of running the most powerful country in the world. But it's all being overshadowed by this book. Its contents forcing the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson into a remarkable statement, having to assert that he believes President Trump is mentally fit for office. And now the president himself has tweeted, "Throughout my life, my two greatest assets have been mental stability and being really smart. I went from very successful businessman to top TV star to President of the United States. I think that would qualify as not smart, but genius, and a very stable genius at that." So why is the President of the United States having to assert his own mental competence? Fire and Fury quotes Trump's former top aide, Steve Bannon, the man who was the power behind the throne, the man credited with getting Trump elected. He's cited as describing a meeting between a Russian lawyer and Mr. Trump's son, Donald Jr., as treasonous. It's one of many supposed revelations painting a picture of a chaotic White House, a claim also that White House staff saw President Trump as a child.
They all came to the conclusion, gradually at first and then faster and faster, that something was unbelievably amiss here, that this was more peculiar than they ever imagined it could be.
But the president, as ever, has offered up a robust response overnight, tweeting, "Michael Wolff is a total loser who made up stories in order to sell this really boring and untruthful book. He used sloppy Steve Bannon, who cried when he got fired and begged for his job." But no matter what words come from President Trump, he'll likely struggle to drown out these volumes. Jessica Parker, BBC News.
Well, the BBC correspondent David Willis has more now from Washington.
Well, it's an extraordinary and unwelcome distraction, of course, Samantha. President Trump has been hosting, or is hosting today, Republican leaders at Camp David, and he'd been hoping to focus on his legislative agenda, reform of welfare, infrastructure spending, and so on. But now he finds himself defending his mental fitness for office. Now, Republican leaders won't be too happy with that because I think coming off this success at the end of last year over the tax reform bill, they were hoping to go into this new year with a much more rosy and stable political platform ahead of them. Well, now they have these allegations to contend with. They're pretty solidly behind Donald Trump at the moment, but Mr. Trump is not making it any easier for himself, of course, with these shrill tweets. More of them today. We heard some of them in that report there, defending himself, or at least attempting to.
Now that this book has been out for less than 24 hours, many people have had time to read it all and digest what's in there. What's your assessment of how damaging it really is and the accusations in it?
Well, the accusations are very damning. There's no question about that. These are allegations that Donald Trump doesn't listen, doesn't read, that he has the attention span of a child, and there are accusations as well about his family, that people around him all at one stage or another, it says, came to the same conclusion that this man was not fit to hold the office of President of the United States. But like I say, there have been books written. There will be other books written, I'm sure, by people who've had access to the West Wing. And in previous administrations, those books have just been largely ignored. President Trump, of course, is not a man willing to just walk away from those sort of accusations.
David Willis in Washington there. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the news this hour. And Malaysia has agreed to allow an American exploration firm to continue hunting for the missing flight MH370 a year after the search ended. Only small pieces of wreckage have been recovered. The Transport Minister said Ocean Infinity had been awarded the deal on a no-find, no-fee basis. Germany's foreign minister says he's agreed with his Turkish counterpart to do all they can to improve relations between the countries. There have been numerous disagreements, notably over the arrest of German journalists in Turkey following the abortive coup in 2016. Hundreds of people have gathered at a beach near Athens to see the Blessing of the Waters ceremony to mark the Epiphany weekend. Tradition dictates a Greek Orthodox priest throws a wooden cross into the sea, with swimmers competing to catch it. Reports from Syria say 17 people have been killed in airstrikes in rebel-held eastern Ghouta. The British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said another 60 people were wounded in the besieged rebel stronghold close to the capital Damascus. More strikes in this area and in the rebel-held northern province of Idlib have been reported by air workers. They say 10 hospitals had been hit by Syrian government and Russian bombers over the past 10 days. Well, our correspondent Alan Johnson has more on this.
More recently, the world's attention has tended to stray away a bit from the war in Syria. There's been a feeling that it's perhaps winding down, that the government and its allies are getting on top of the rebels. But in some places it is raging on, and one of them is the eastern Ghouta rebel-held enclave on the edge of Damascus. Rebels holding out there for years, but under a great deal of pressure now. There have been more airstrikes in the course of today, and we're hearing reports of more civilian deaths there as well. Earlier in the day we were talking to an advisor from a coalition of medical aid agencies operating in rebel-held areas, and he said that over the past 10 days or so, something like 10 hospitals, medical facilities had been hit, most of them in that eastern Ghouta area, but some too in the northern rebel-held province of Idlib. And this organisation has listed these incidents. To give you just one example, a maternity hospital was hit apparently 3 days ago in a northern town. One patient killed, other people wounded, including a senior operator of the hospital. These are the sort of reports that we're getting.
So what are the government trying to achieve, do you think?
Well, you take this area, eastern Ghouta, the besieged enclave on the edge of Damascus. This is an area that would very much concern the government. It wouldn't like the presence of that large force of rebels right on the doorstep of the center of power. The rebels also in a position to fire rockets, mortars into residential areas of Damascus, and you see the government trying for a long time now to make progress there to try to neutralize that sort of threat.
As you said, in recent months, the world attention has moved away from the conflict in Syria, which has been going on for years now. If you can just give us an overall picture of the situation.
It's a large battlefield, many smaller wars, if you like, going on in different ways in different parts of the country. Remember, for years we were focusing on the presence of the Islamic State group, which controlled a large part of the north and east of the country. But over the past year we've seen the so-called caliphate rather broken and snuffed out, and what we have left now in terms of the fighting that we see at the present would be these two large areas predominantly of rebel-held presence, edge of Damascus and that rebel-held province in the north. And I think in the weeks and months ahead we're going to see perhaps some fierce fighting in both those areas.
Alan Johnson talking to me a little earlier. Now, after the biggest anti-government protests for years, Iran has seen a number of pro-government rallies on Saturday. Those taking part pledged solidarity to the regime and chanted anti-Western slogans. State television showed marches in Iranian cities including Amol, Semnan and Shadagan, but many anti-government protesters continue to be detained. Families have visited prisons to try and find out more about their loved ones. The protests have become an issue at the United Nations, where other countries have rounded on the United States for calling a meeting of the Security Council to discuss the situation in Iran. Barbara Plett-Usher reports.
Nikki Haley warned Iran that the world was watching its response to the anti-government protests. She used the platform of the UN to amplify the message of President Trump, who's been tweeting support for the Iranian demonstrators.
The Iranian people will determine their own destiny. And let there be no doubt whatsoever, the United States stands unapologetically with those in Iran who seek freedom for themselves, prosperity for their families, and dignity for their nation. We will not be quiet. No dishonest attempt to call the protesters puppets of foreign powers will change that. The Iranian people know the truth, and we know the truth.
This unusually robust stance on human rights by the Trump administration coincides with a policy to curb what it sees as Iran's malign influence in the Middle East. The Iranian ambassador called the meeting a farce and repeated charges that the protests were directed from abroad, which Ms. Haley denied.
There is a long history of U.S. bullying at the UN, but this is a preposterous example. The purely internal affairs of a nation, in this case protests that the Iranian government has addressed with the utmost respect for the rights of the protesters and with every attempt to deal with peacefully, despite violent infiltrators and direct encouragement by foreign forces, including by the President of the United States.
Other council members urged Tehran to allow free and peaceful demonstrations, but some suggested this was an internal matter, not an international threat. And the Russian ambassador accused the U.S. of playing politics.
Mr. President, the real reason for convening today's meeting is not an attempt to protect human rights or promote the interests of the Iranian people, but rather as a veiled attempt to use the current moment to continue to undermine the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
That's the agreement which restricts Iran's nuclear program, which Mr. Trump says is deeply flawed. He has to decide next week whether to continue waiving sanctions suspended under the deal. Barbara Plett-Usher, BBC News, Washington.
Stay with us here on BBC World News. Still to come, all the sport for you, including the latest from the English Football FA's third cup round.
The Japanese people are in mourning following the death of Emperor Hirohito. Thousands converged on the imperial palace to pay their respects when it was announced he was dead.
Good grief. After half a century of delighting fans around the world, Charlie Brown and the rest of the gang are calling it quits.
The singer Paul Simon starts his tour of South Africa tomorrow in spite of protests and violence from some black activist groups. They say international artists should continue to boycott South Africa until majority rule is established.
Teams were trying to scoop up lumps of oil as France recognizes it faces an ecological crisis. 3 weeks ago, the authorities confidently assured these areas that oil from the broken tanker Erika would head out to sea. It didn't.
The world's tallest skyscraper opens later today. The Burj Dubai has easily overtaken its nearest rivals.
BBC World News, the latest headlines. President Trump rejects suggestions he is mentally unfit for office, describing describing himself as a stable genius. Airstrikes on rebel strongholds near the Syrian capital Damascus. Aid workers say hospitals are being targeted. The east coast of North America is shivering in a record-breaking freeze. It comes after a massive snowstorm that reached as far south as Florida. In parts of the US, temperatures are forecast to fall below minus 30 degrees Celsius. The extreme weather has so far been linked to up to 19 deaths in the US and 2 more in Canada. Tom Donkin reports.
It's been called a bomb cyclone, and it's a weather system which has lived up to its name. On Thursday, warm air carried an area of low pressure up the east coast of America to meet the already icy conditions. That combination exploded in snowfall and hurricane-force winds to a large part of the US and Canada. Residents of Boston were blanketed in more than 30 centimeters of snow. And while that's largely stopped falling, the plummeting temperatures are now the biggest concern. Here it's forecast to drop below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Add to that the strong icy winds, and these are temperatures which feel more like minus 70 degrees. Cold enough to freeze and burst pipes, like here in Cincinnati. For some, a life on the streets has turned into a fight for survival. Right now, this homeless shelter is taking in more than 100 people extra each night.
People in the neighborhood have been looking out for us, you know, because
they come by bringing us sweatpants. I mean,
they
they're
brought
totally
us
looking
clothes.
out for us. Socks, sweatpants.
Yeah.
I mean, more than we even need.
Here in Washington, the offer of a hot meal is not just an act of kindness, but a lifeline. Forecasters believe these dangerously low temperatures are set to linger throughout the weekend. The hope being by early next week, we may see a return to readings somewhere above freezing and much closer to the seasonal norm. Tom Donkin, BBC News.
Several major UK employers have been revealed to pay women on average at least 15% less than men per hour. The figures have been revealed after the government made disclosure mandatory for 500 of the biggest firms. At the airline EasyJet, women earn 52% less per hour than men overall. At the banking company Virgin Money, the difference is 33%. The firm with the biggest gap revealed so far is the women's clothing chain Phase 8. The mean hourly rate for female staff is 64.8% lower. The firm says men and women are paid equally in the same roles. They just have more men in higher paying jobs. Well, with me now is Kate Andrews, news editor for the Institute for Economic Affairs. Thanks very much for coming in. Nice to see you. What do you make of these figures?
I think they are deeply misleading. If anything, they are hurting the conversation around the gender pay gap. The way that the government is making these companies disclose their figures does not compare jobs like for like. This is so crucial if we're to actually understand if there's a gender pay gap, if women are getting paid less than men based on doing the same job. As these companies that are being accused of having massive gender pay gaps have rightly come out today and said, they are not. If you compare jobs like for like, men and women are getting paid the same. But that's not what's being reported, so you get these outrageous headlines about 52% gender pay gaps that simply aren't true.
The argument a lot of these companies are making is that men are paid more because they're in more senior roles. Is that justified? Shouldn't they be seeking to have more women in those senior roles and therefore earning more as well?
It's a great question, and let's look at the EasyJet example. So apparently EasyJet has a 52% gender pay gap. They have roughly 6% of their pilots as women, and they get paid almost $100K a year compared to the cabin crew, who get paid about $25K a year. That is slightly above the average of the number of female pilots in the UK. So if anything, EasyJet is slightly discriminating towards women and trying to pay them as much as they can. But you can't accuse EasyJet of discriminating against women when these pilots don't even exist. So there's an excellent example where that 52% figure is just wildly misleading. If anything, EasyJet is helping women, and they're trying to employ as many women as they can.
But that may not be an example that's relevant to many companies because pilots are traditionally a male-dominated role.
That's the headline example today, isn't it?
It is, but then we've got other companies such as Virgin Money, such as Ladbrokes, such as Phase 8, who have a massive differential in the amount that men and women are paid. So again, shouldn't they be seeking to get more women in senior roles, and therefore there won't be this argument.
I would love to see more women in senior roles, but I think what you're tapping into is where we need to have a more thoughtful conversation about why women pursue different careers, make different choices. A lot of it is down to personal choice, and I don't think that's a problem to be solved. Some of it is societal. Women are still bearing the brunt of childcare and household chores, and women need to start having serious conversations with their husbands and partners and saying, look, you know, I'm pushing back on this. You have to be a full-time dad or a part-time dad as well. That's for us as a society to tackle, and I think that's the harder argument. There's no evidence that employers, however, are discriminating against women. If you look at men and women moving down the same career paths with the same trajectory, if they follow them, they will do equally as well. So I think that figures like this are just moving us away from talking about how successful women have been in the workplace, closing that gender pay gap, and what we now need to do to actually help women in more serious issues like domestic violence and rape.
Okay, Kate Andrews from the Institute for Economic Affairs, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, 2 passenger jets have collided on the ground at a Toronto airport. One of the planes caught fire, but there are no reports of serious injuries. It's the second such collision at Toronto Pearson International in 5 months. Bill Hayton reports.